Dr. Chris Kerr, I am so happy to have you on my show. You're the second Kerr on my show, but you have a unique story, a unique perspective, and one that the world needs to hear. So, in your own words, how would you like to describe who is Dr. Chris Kerr?
Oh gosh. Um, well, I guess I'd start off by saying I'm a physician that specializes in hospice and palliative care for the last 25 years. Um, and as an aside, I also have a PhD in neurobiology, so I have a research background and started researching the subjective experiences of dying probably 15 years ago.
What is remarkable about your trajectory, Chris, is that you started off, you are a physician, and you really talk very much about the way the medical community, the medical training tends to avoid the topic of death. And what you did after you had your father's passing and that experience is you really lent into death. Can you talk us through that journey from, let's say, being a typical physician to somebody who has another regard for and need to talk about death?
Yeah, actually, I leaned away from it. I was in the traditional mainstream of medicine and was absolutely enamored with acute care. Loved emergency rooms, loved the intensive care unit, loved cardiology. And this was more an accident. I was just moonlighting to support my family at hospice, but completely untrained and not knowing what to do. And so I started working here on weekends periodically. And that really forced me to be a different type of doctor, to be present, to worry less about what I was doing to somebody, but who I was to somebody. And the contrast between swinging from cardiology to a hospice inpatient unit was striking, but enriching and meaningful. So I changed paths, and it's 25 years later, and I've never looked back.
It strikes me that this is my opinion, that at the core of the issue is the Hippocratic Oath. Well, I've read it, and or at least I've read portions of it to the best of my abilities in English, of course. And it seems that the idea of saving patients and ensuring everything to avoid them dying is what being a doctor is all about. Yet what you have done is sort of gone to the other side and looked at how to accept it and to make it a comfortable experience. Is that a fair statement?
No, actually, the oath says something entirely different. The intention and promise of the oath is beautiful. It's two sides of a sword, then one side's been dulled. So the promise is to treat where possible, but to comfort always. And what's happened as technical medicine has evolved, and an organ-based approach to human suffering has taken over, we're obsessed with the intervention and acts of doing. And when you are no longer deemed curative, first of all, we have a hard time recognizing that. And so we've got more and more uncomfortable with our role as physicians as being comforters. So we're fine as long as we're in a system that allows us to be interventional and to bill. I mean, the whole economics of healthcare is built along, it's not enough just to be suffering, you need to do. It's transactional. And what that's done is it's created miracles on one hand, but it's forgotten the totality of the person and particularly their experience. And when you are deemed no longer curative, particularly in the Western world, you kind of fall off the cliff. You go from getting $1 million treatment in a comprehensive cancer center, and then when you're no longer responding to treatment, you kind of fall off this cliff. So the patient is seen in as much as they're not dying. And of course, the irony is when they need help the most, there's often the least amount to be received.
Beautiful. Thank you for the correction. And I wonder to what extent this falling off the cliff or this disruption, the transactional element, is more societal or medical school led, if you will? I
Oh,
mean,
it's such a
or
good point. It's both. On the medical school side, absolutely. We become enamored with technology. Um, and they've done studies looking at how often the word dying is used in medical textbooks, and it's rare. In fact, when I was a resident, we would have somebody on our teaching service, and when they were deemed dying, we would sign off because there was nothing more to learn. So we institutionalized patient abandonment as part of our educational system. As a society, we're obviously ageist. We're death denying. We're consumers of healthcare. There's always this notion that there's something you can do about something. We've sterilized dying. People used to die in their homes with their families in a village. There'd be ceremonies around it and whatnot, and they were remembrances. And now you kind of go off somewhere, and you die in a unit in a cold and dehumanizing space. So you're right. It's both.
as you said in your speech, your amazing TEDx speech, there are two things people fear the most: death and public speaking. So I'm a public speaker. You're a
Yeah.
death specialist, but this notion of society's ageism, and I mean the billions of dollars that are being poured into anti-aging, anti-senescence,
Yeah.
immortality, it
Yeah.
seems like an illness in itself.
Yes. Yeah. And one that we can't evade. Um, and I often see when the biology meets reality, um, and people get to that inevitable point. It's hard to age gracefully in the Western world.
Hmm. I think that the problem can also be existing in other countries in the East, where we only have one or two children, whereas before we might have had
Yeah.
10. It was like you had a football team, well, soccer team, and one or two die, and oh, no biggie, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now you have one or two, and they are obviously precious and
Yeah.
and made out to be sort of godlike sometimes at the dinner table. It's all
Mhm.
about them as opposed to us and community.
Yeah, very much, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So in one of your one of the sentences I extracted from your TEDx, you said, in our culture, the richest and most thoughtful discussions have always come from the humanities and never medicine, but from poets, playwrights, and philosophers. And I was wondering what kind of reading you do that inspires you and the types of poets, playwrights that you
Oh,
enjoy reading.
gosh, it's a wide range. Um, I'm a huge John Steinbeck fan.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I grew up on Shakespeare. Um, yeah, I think that the humanities, if in the humanities, they ponder existence, they ponder the soul, and so they bring life to those dimensions in a way medicine, at least modern medicine, can't. So what happened was when I went to um, the basis of the research was I was trying to teach this to students, and we live in an evidence-based time, and they would of course say, well, there's no evidence for this. And there was some truth to that. There was anecdotal case studies and third-person reporting, but it was rich in the humanities. It's rich within other cultures. Um, so it's in the Bible. Citizen Kane. That's where the experience, the subjective elements of dying are discussed and pondered. Yeah.
One of the things going back to the medical community that we were talking about, and struck me was that you make a line somehow between doctors and nurses in their experience or regard on death.
Yeah, that's very perceptive. Yes. So the closer you are, I learned this the hard way because it was nurses who taught me on this subject. The closer you are to the bedside, so in less of a transactional way, but more present. around the model of caring, rather than rounding, let's say, rather than spot welding. The more likely you are to have a deeper appreciation for what the patient feels, what they see, what they fear, all of these other elements that really nurses capture so beautifully. So what I find is when I lecture to a group of nurses, and I've had this happen the same day, the audience is all shaking their heads, and I'm not really telling them anything they don't know, because there is not, I've discovered nothing. I've just shone a light on something that's always been known but lost. I mean, it's still held on to in other cultures. Indigenous people around the world hold on to these beliefs. Whereas doctors who are more and more only live in the sphere of the objective, don't appreciate what can't be biopsied or imaged or quantified. They're more, as I mentioned, they're more comfortable with the brain than the mind. And so feeling is something you compartmentalize off to spiritual care or psychiatry, but it's not within the toolbox necessarily of the physician. But if a nurse is doing their job and they're present and they're hearing what the patient has experienced, they tend to grasp this.
I've done a few rounds with doctors, and what struck me was that in the rounds that you do, especially when you're in a university or learning environment, you spend a lot more time off the ball than on the ball. And what I mean by that is talking outside the patient's room, conferring and talking, and then only a few minutes actually at the bedside.
Oh my God, you're so right. I never thought of it that way. But yeah. Well, it used to be worse in a paternalistic version of a male-dominated medical culture. That extended to the point that there was one conversation with the patient that was fictitious and one conversation outside of the patient's room that was accurate. So when I started, it was not uncommon to get on the phone with the doctor, and the doctor says, yeah, well, I know she's dying, but I don't want to take away hope. Meanwhile, it's that person's life to negotiate and to understand. And, you're not protecting them from the reality. They figure it out. It's their body and their life. But what you're doing is you're taking away their ability to choose what information they have access to. But yeah, you're right. Yeah.
There are many cultural differences to death. And so in France, I have a memory of someone near to me who had terminal cancer. And rather than tell the patient, they told his son, because they wanted him to stay with Hope, the father. And then the son had to deal with the mechanics and the logistics.
Well, yeah, that never works because you can't be protected from your own reality. Even if you look at our work, they become self-informed. We see this with children who they often haven't had that discussion around mortality. They don't have reference points, but their end-of-life experiences inform them as they go. You can't. I once had a patient who was dying who asked to go to rehab so he could get stronger, so he could confront the physician who had lied about his status, because it had so many practical implications. He had told his daughter from California not to fly in. He owned a company. He wanted to have this party where he was, going to make all these speeches, and he was deprived the ability to manage the own trajectory of his last days of life because a doctor felt he could deceive him from the reality. And the reality is the people who die worst are the people who are not prepared. The people who die best still hope for cure, hope for recovery, but also prepare for the worst. And people can do those two things at once, and they can do them well. Where this becomes important is not just for the patient, but for the family. So a young parent, I've seen this many times, who didn't know until the very end and had lost that window to have those very important conversations with dependent children, to bring in counselors or religious figures into their life. All that gets lost. There's practical considerations that people get deprived of all the time. And if you look at the prognostication data, it's horrible. They're off by a factor of 2 to 3. erring on the side of longer. And unfortunately, what they do is they'll tell you when you're going to die, but not how you're going to die. So you may live 6 months, but you may not know that 4 of those months you may be bedbound and need help. It's not like you're walking along and you fall over. There's a decline.
One of the things that's most mysterious to me is knowledge of when I'm going to die, or at least that I'm dying. Some people might, you can have the hypochondriacs saying, oh, I've got a cold, I'm going to die. And then some people may have an illness and believe they're going to die, and maybe that then foreshadows what's going to happen, or at least makes them, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. To what extent does someone who is dying have a better grasp of that than you as a doctor? When can that happen?
Oh, often. It's fascinating. Particularly the older they get, because you accept the inevitable differently if you have less dependent lives around you, as opposed to the young parent who can deny the reality. Oh, but it's very, very common that they self-inform. It's their body. They used to be able to go up the stairs, now they can't. Then they used to be able to get their mail, now they can't. They want to nap more. They don't feel like eating the same amount. They look at their arm and it's half the size. So they know. Illness has this way at its root of pulling you to rest and to sleep. And people interpret that. They know what that means. And some people welcome it, particularly if there's been a struggle within an illness, and it feels better to do less. So they often are able to extrapolate. It's funny we're having this conversation, because today was the first time in 10 months, at least, that I had somebody who was truly unaccepting of and they're actively dying. They'll probably be dead by tomorrow. And it was very interesting because they had signed on for a naturopathic management, which is often like joining a cult, because there's not a lot of evidence necessarily, but you've got to have full and complete devotion and faith, which is great as an additive treatment. So she had gone on to this naturopathic room. She's actively dying. The family feels robbed because they didn't have any conversation. But it's rare.
So I'd like to zero in on this notion of conversation. The society rejects it, denies it. Medical school never talks about it, also denies it somehow. And it's often more difficult for somebody, or it can be difficult for somebody who's not dying to be talking with someone who is dying. For lack of words, you don't know what to say. It's the same for grieving. If someone loses something very close, I'm sorry, condolences, but you feel awkward. What kind of advice would you have for individuals who have someone close to them who is dying? What roads into it? I mean, obviously you talk about the idea of visions. That seems like an interesting topic, but what's your approach to that conversation?
It's a great question. Thank you. Well, first of all, we tend to sterilize the dying, to put them on the shelf and to treat them like they're frail and fragile. And the truth is, and dying patients will tell you this, dying is lonely and it's isolating. And we don't need to make it more isolating by not engaging. It's shocking. When we went to do this study, the university didn't give it approval at first because they thought, oh my gosh, the patients are dying, you can't intrude. And I said, well, how many of you actually care for anyone dying? I said, they're lying in bed and they're looking at a white ceiling. And what they want to do is connect and to feel human. So when everyone has this instinct to keep at a distance, actually what they want to do is feel less lonely, to feel connected, that their words matter. So in our effort to humanize, we need to relate, not distance ourselves. And I think there's this tendency to over-inquire about how people feel and everything. They get a lot of that. right? And I don't meet many people who, except for the hypochondriac, who want to be seen, identified, or defined by illness. They want to talk about other things, things that make them feel human again, connected and mattering. So I think that's the best thing, is to be less fearful, to get closer, not farther from the bed, um, and to engage with as much normalcy as you're capable of doing.
I love this word mattering. It's there's a doctor, no, so he's a professor, John Vervaeke. He talks about the importance of mattering today. In the end of the day, relationships is the most important thing. And it sparks a thought, Chris, which is this: in this transactional world, there are those who might say, "Oh, she's dying. There's no worth buying her a present for Christmas."
Mm.
A reduction
Yeah.
to the most transactional, consumerist of methods, where and we don't know how to do anything else. We don't know how to do the relationship thing. Well, what worth is it to make her smile today, right now? She's going to die anyway.
Well, let me contextualize this a little bit. So when we were doing our studies, and we've done published 7 or 8. The initial thought was people wouldn't want to participate. And they certainly want to be video. So we videotaped a lot of people. That's what became part of the Netflix series and the PBS documentary. As they thought, well, they're disfigured, they're ill appearing, whatever. And what happened was the opposite. Almost with very few exceptions did anyone not want to participate in the study. These are people sometimes days away from death. And this is what gets lost, is the thought is, well, there's no secondary gain. They're never going to read it. They're never going to see it. They're never going to be congratulated, recognized, anything. No attaboys. But what happens with dying is that hope transitions, meaning transitions. So it transitions from hopes of cure to hope for others. So the idea that people thought they were contributing was enough for them to muster all their strength, try to put their makeup on, smile, talk to the camera, and contribute right up until the last days. And I just think that's such a beautiful story. So I think we need to worry about less what secondary gain there is, the Christmas it's not going to be seen, what have you. But again, it just goes to the fact that they want to matter and they still see worth in contributing. I just think it's an amazing story that that really everybody wanted to, and the university predicted the opposite, because we had a large number of people we wanted to capture, and they thought, oh, we'll never do that, and we did very easily.
You said in your TEDx, you said end of life experiences not only tied to our personal meanings, but they are tied to some of our greatest needs: the need to love, to be loved, nurtured, forgiven. And in those elements, there's this other.
Yes.
The need to be loved by others, the need to nurture others.
Yes. Life as you're dying gets to distilled into what matters. And what matters most is our greatest achievement, which is our relationships. And that's all, when you first get diagnosed, there's fears and there's practical concerns. As you get closer to death, you're not worried where your car keys are, what your tax bill is. It just, it's a vantage point that changes your perception, and your perspective, and your focus. And you draw on the things that mattered most from living. And time seems to go away and you become very reflective naturally.
Present.
Yes. Yeah, right. Yeah, present.
You mentioned loneliness before, and I wonder to what extent the issue with death is also the issue that society has with death, is a reflection of the epidemic of loneliness that we have all along our lives these days. There's many studies that show that we are completely lonely despite being fully connected in today's world, and mental health conditions are spiraling. If you're a CEO, it's one of the loneliest jobs out there. we end up being lonely in our lives, and then all that to end up lonely at death.
Mhm. But I think that the dying don't feel, I think illness is lonely. I'm not so sure as you get closer to the end, they feel so lonely. Because, the vast majority of people that we study are experiencing these things and they end up feeling very connected. Maybe not to people that are present in front of them, but people who they're thinking about. We saw this during COVID because the fear was, there they are separated from humans that they love. But if you actually talk to the patients themselves when their eyes were closed, and dying's progressive sleep, right? People don't die awake, they just sleep more. They report a very different experience. They're bathed in memories and recollections and remembrances. So I think they leave us more connected than alone.
And then there's this whole topic of the visions that we have. I want to dive in on that in a moment, but recently I was just talking with my wife about how for her great aunt, the doctor said, "Oh, she's delusional," just before dying. And when I talked about your concept of visions, she's like, "Oh, well, that's totally true." So it felt real, but it was sort of shocking that the doctor would say, "Oh, delusional." Oh, she's flipping off. She's talking about dead people who don't exist anymore, and which is very much all your topic. And the reason, or the topic I'd like to sort of segue into is hallucinations, because today I work a lot in AI, and they always talk about AI, artificial intelligence that hallucinates. But I also like to talk about psychedelics, and there's a whole lot of body of work on how psychedelics helps with fear of death. And I was wondering to what extent that's part of your work, and the idea of visions and psychedelic hallucinations. Is there any relationship in there?
Oh yeah. In fact, we're working on a part of a documentary that's being done by a two-time Emmy Award winner and an Academy Award nominee. And
Nice.
they were working with Indigenous people on something else, found out their beliefs around dying. And then she read my book. And then she phones me and says, these guys have language for this. I go, yeah, no, I know I didn't discover this. And so she's pairing that with our work. That led into the psychedelic space. And so they've done some fascinating work where I wish I could share the trailer. It'll be out probably, it'll be in plans to Sundance in 25, but
Nice.
they gave psychedelics to dying patients that absolutely addressed their fear. And gave them a whole new view. And the Indigenous have been doing this forever. We are involved in some work here. The problem in the state I'm in, which is New York, we're very behind. And so there's three pieces of legislation in front of the state to make it more legal. So the work that's done here is underground. So I'm not directly experienced with it, but indirectly through the film and obviously through talking with others. It's the experiences are very similar to what happens endogenously at end of life for people. I think they're amped up a little more colorful. But yeah, they're similar.
I interviewed a friend who runs a ketamine assisted therapy session in New York City. So hopefully we're getting there. But so
I've been doing ketamine for 20 years. Ketamine we do. I just took a patient off of it last week after 7 days. We use it as a treatment for pain and opioid tolerance. Secondarily, it manages very well existential or psychogenic distress. The problem with the ketamine clinics and everything is the effect is brief.
mhm.
It's not sustained.
Yeah, the whole notion of integration is the challenge, right?
Yeah, yeah. But it gets people, particularly people who are severely distressed, back into a workable space. Yeah.
That's progress.
Yeah.
And in terms of the visions that you talk about, how as we get closer to death, we have these visions that are reconciling ourselves with past problems, maybe a lot of visualization of people who we've missed, who've died already, and those type of visions. To what extent is there a correlation between the psychedelic visions and those type of non-psychedelic visions, are we just a colorful version of seeing my dead mother again, or dead
No, I
person past?
think the psychedelic version is turbocharged and goes a lot. The end of life dreams and visions are pure in the sense that they don't include great pronouncements and epiphanies, right? They're sitting around the kitchen table with those you've loved and you've lost. It's seeing the dog from your childhood. It's self-explanatory. It feels natural. The psychedelic charged experience opens up channels of consciousness and awareness that it's like an acid trip in a sense. It's powerful stuff. It's colorized. But you come out of it with the same therapeutic experience, and that it's relieving, it's comforting, it's inciting for you. There's something happens, but they're different. They're very, very different.
The way I'm interpreting that, Chris, is you've got the one which is the conversation around the table in the kitchen, which is sort of simple, and the other one which is a million thoughts at 100 miles an hour in multicolor. That's sort of the acid trip, which is just too many things, and it's far less simple in that respect.
Yes. And I've never had a patient come out of end of life experiences and ask, what does this mean? Like, the time for therapy is over. There's no work to do. If you lost your mom when you were a child and you see your mother, that's self-explanatory and it's yours. So there's no interpretive work. There's no work at all. It's a very peaceful, soothing process that doesn't require additional input. Whereas I think people sometimes, like near-death experiences, which is kind of fake dying, they come up with all sorts of puzzles and need to change or prosthesize or whatever, right? That's very, very different than people who are actually died. It's more passive and more obvious. And I think the psychedelic ones, it's some heavy, heavy stuff. I mean, the idea is you're opening aspects of your mind that you weren't aware of. Yeah.
And you can't control.
No, and that's a little worrisome in a way. I mean, one of the problems when these sort of drugs emerge less from a scientific way is, what's the quality? What's the dosing? Who's a good candidate? Who's not a good candidate? So I'm talking to people who've done this for a long time, and they're seeing some potential for misuse. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's no doubt. I'm interested in one of the of the different cases you talk about, that this visioning happens when you're young as well. You talk about a 10-year-old boy who has this vision, and it synchronizes with the death of somebody that he didn't even know had died, being in his, I think that's the story. But I was shocked because you did mention before that sometimes younger people will have different type of existential issues about dying versus an older person. But this vision idea, these visions happen even in the younger people.
Well, they do it better. It's the same way that people who are neurally different, cognitively different, do it better. Well, because there's no edification. Children can imagine better. For example, they don't distinguish between the animal and the human world in the same way. A doll can have
puppets,
yeah, right. And then they're also not fearful of ridicule or judgment. So the ease and back and forth between the children that we've studied and filmed are the most impressive. And they're not worried about judgment, so it just comes out naturally, right? They tend to do it better, and we've seen the same thing with the demented. People who have pretty advanced dementia almost have an easier access to this.
I want to get into this other topic, which is assisted suicide and euthanasia, because at the end of the day, this is less natural at some level. And to what extent, well, So what's your opinion on that area? Of course, it depends. There's a legal issue in here, but from a societal standpoint, there are many countries that have gone much further along the path of allowing it. I've seen the disadvantages of not having the option for that in terms of end of life, quality of life. What's your opinion on that? And then I want to get into the vision portion
Yeah, I mean,
afterwards.
I'm Canadian, so
Hmm,
it's very, uh, it's pretty far evolved in Canada. So I have a lot of
indeed.
friends whose loved ones, but I live in the United States where it's a very different view. I'll tell you what, we were sitting at a medical meeting of palliative care doctors. Between us, there was probably 200 years of experience taking care of complex ill and dying patients. And between us, we had maybe had 5 patients in our careers who had asked for a hastened death. And so there's a disconnect between the mainstream culture's discussion of this as an issue and those of us who actually do this work. And one of my concerns is that how many people who choose this as an option are have not received good palliative care. So, because we see an enormous amount of suffering, and it's really is a failure to treat. So, there's not many symptoms that we can't get an upper hand on. So I just have I'm struck by that. How is it that those of us who live this day to day don't hear this much, but it's so common in the literature, or so common in the portraying of it outside of us. So that I worry. Ultimately, where I fall is patient autonomy. Um, I just don't. I have trouble with it as a doctor here because I think I need to be respectful of everybody's view, including those that may have a religious um, uh, commitment that's different from ours. So I'm very reluctant to make a policy of it for us here, but at the same time, I respect individual choice. I just fascinated that we don't see it in practice. There's disease exception for me personally, and I'll give you an example of what it is for me. It's ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, because that's a disease where you can anticipate what lies ahead, right? So you're having escalating loss of function, including the ability to swallow, protect your airway, speak. And I think there is no lessening of that symptom burden. And psychologically, I can understand that not meeting the criteria of any quality of life for somebody. So I don't think we should look at disease as a monolith. I think we need to appreciate patient autonomy. Ultimately, it's their life, But I just think the caveat should be, is this unmanaged malignant depression? Is this pain that hasn't been properly addressed? Is this nausea that's unremitting? Has everything been done? We see so much poor symptom management that it makes me worry, who's out there and why are they suffering so much?
Well, would you not also add into that mismanagement how families manage around without knowledge of it, fear of death? And it makes me think of Gawande's book, Being Mortal, how even as a doctor, he was less good at managing his father's lost ways. And sometimes selfishly as a child, oh, I wish you'd live on for longer. I want you to see my babies, your grandparents, I want you to do this as opposed to the other person who's dying.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But some of those conversations need to be brokered. So we do a lot of that, and there's a lot of miscommunication between what the patients experience and what the families see. But that's one of the objectives of palliative care is synthesizing the case, understanding the wishes and fears of the patient, understanding where the family is, are they plugged in properly. A lot of it too, I should mention, is that the process of dying is so poorly addressed that it's a void that is filled with fear. When in reality, if you saw most of our dying patients here, they're sleeping comfortably. They're not medicated induced sleeps, but their symptoms are managed. Oftentimes it's not sexy things like, their bladder's emptied and they're not constipated anymore. Their cough's controlled. But I think that because it's not addressed, very few people come in here knowing what to expect. So one of our first interventions is having discussions around what does the process look like. And you can watch people just go, because they just assume the worst. And their experiences of illness is often bad. So they project out that dying's going to be far worse. And usually it's quieter. Nature takes care of this pretty well.
Hmm. So I've had the extraordinary experience of talking to two individuals who were sentenced to death and actually executed, except they survived the execution.
Oh,
And one in Iran and one in Ukraine. And then there's the other one, which, let's say, the assisted suicide, where there's a sort of a premeditation of the death. There's also near-death experiences. And all along those, I was wondering to what extent visions might happen when it's more like forced or unexpected at some level, like the
yeah.
car accident that kills you. Just do you think there's flying through visions as you're dying
Yeah,
in
oh,
the car?
absolutely. I mean, it's impossible to study. But the expression "my life flashed before my eyes."
Mm-hmm.
When George Floyd was having the air squeezed out of his chest, he's
Talk to
called for
mother.
his mother.
Mm.
Men in battlefields were often crying for parents not there. So I think there's a suggestion that even in the case of acute or subacute dying, that they're plugging into something. They're flooded with some kind of something experiential that we don't necessarily know or appreciate. It's a great question.
I have two last questions, Chris. One
Yeah,
is sparked from your presentation or talking about this World War II veteran, John,
yeah.
who was in Normandy. And I've done a documentary film myself on the Second World War and interviewed 130 veterans of the Second World War, most of whom were prisoners of the Japanese. And the link I have is this notion of humility. Not
Mhm.
that they were all humble pie, but there was a greater sense of humility and community, it feels, in the past. Maybe it's romanticized. And to what extent that sense of humility and community is a greater gateway to accepting death, as opposed to the type of narcissism, loneliness, and fear that seems to be predominant today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's very well said. I wouldn't have used the word humility, but something humanizing takes place. The layers become removed. There's something in the process of becoming ill independent, losing physicality, losing in autonomy, that forces you to stop, to consider, to reflect. So you end up in a very different place perspective wise, when you're no longer in control. I think that's an awful lot of it. Yeah.
So the last question, Chris, really is sort of, where do you sit now with regard to your own mortality? I have to imagine you've reflected on this, and do you imagine yourself taking a bunch of psilocybin, moving in towards the last steps? How do you approach? What have you learned for yourself from your entire bank of experience?
Oh, well, I'm a cancer patient, so uh, I can tell you that being a hospice doctor and also a cancer patient, that I'm as scared shitless as the next person. Um, the the issue is not when I'm doing better, but in the dark moments around diagnosis, etc., that my concern wasn't self. My concern was that I had people who depended on me, whose lives are incomplete with me. And so that strikes a trauma that's hard to put into words. So there's that. The actual processing of dying, though, doesn't make me fearful. So where I end up is thinking there's a better story. I'm not religious. We don't do this work as a looking through a keyhole into afterlife or paranormal. But after doing it for so many decades, you can't help but recognize that the love and meaning that we've experienced for having lived seems to be accessible to us to the very end. And that the things that really secured and can us loved us properly are still there. And so we see it all the time. People who have lost someone from 8 decades ago still feels their presence. So I think there's something there. We're put back together in a way that's very beautiful. And what I'm struck with is the absence of fear. You see our videos, we videotape a lot of patients. The biggest takeaway is the absence of fear. This whole notion of, fighting the dying of the light is for people who aren't yet sick. So perspective changes. So yeah, I'm not fearful of the dying, just not now.
There's there's also the epigenetic element sometimes, right? Passes along. I have to imagine, Chris, that in your conversion to hospice care and the entire message that you're bringing out to the world, the work you're doing, the book, the documentary, that must be very fulfilling and meaningful for you. I mean, at another level than just being a physician.
Yeah, it is. What's interesting, it's kind of a funny story. So this work was all meant for a medical audience. We filmed patients because we thought we knew people would have preconceived notions that these were feeble-minded, frail people who had lost their senses. So we filmed them. And what happened was we published it and never heard a word in the medical community. But what was interesting is that it went into the non-medical community, ended up in the Times, the Post, everything within weeks. And so what is rewarding is that it may not matter to the providers of care on the medical side of the equation, but it matters to the recipients of care, whether today or in the future. And I love that I'm part of that voice that is asking for something other than the doctor's death, where it's a more humanized approach to one's, instead of dying as organ failure, it's life closure. And I think that's fun to be part of.
Is there room for us to move back to the old way of dying at home more often?
Yeah, it's happened. It's actually happened in this country. So the 10 years ago, 75% of Americans wanted to die at home. 75% of Americans didn't. It's now, we've crossed the 50% mark. And what's happened is the baby boomers are reclaiming dying. And we see it in death cafes. We see it in the receptivity to our work. They have questions. They don't tolerate a medical model where they're being told to. They want choice and options. They want to have a say. So we're seeing the arc bend. Absolutely. Yeah.
And that is a wonderful place to close. I want to take one last sentence, which I had wanted to sort of conclude, and I loved it from your TEDx. It says, I hope they leave. This is your stories that you were sharing. You leave open the possibility that there is light within the darkness of dying. Dr. Chris Kerr, it has been an absolute pleasure deep down to listen to you, get a chance to talk with you. You are on a mission I feel very necessary for our life. As a man who has followed the Grateful Dead and always thought that once we embrace death, we are more grateful, that this is what we should be thinking about and not rejecting it, not denying it, but embracing it.
Very well said. Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yay.